a live stream this morning as well. So if you don't want your face or your name shown, please turn off your camera or amend your name for that. And the session will be recorded and made available later on if required. This morning we're taking some evidence from a range of experts on the gaps in support that particularly affect those who have lost out as a result of maternity and during the lockdown. And we're having evidence this morning from Sarah Ronan from Pregnant Then Screwed, Ros Bragg from Maternity Action, Bethany Power, who did the maternity petition, and Sonala Joshi from Excluded UK. There will be a chance for those present to ask questions at the end. And I think it's probably, we've all got lots to say on this issue, I think, but I think there's some real evidence here that the government can put right if we listen very carefully to the speakers and put that proposal to the Treasury. So our first speaker this morning is Sonala Joshi from Excluded UK. Sonali.
Hi there. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to be talking more specifically about issues that affect the self-employed and limited company directors. I think from the speakers that we've got this morning, we're going to hear a range of issues that affect women who have been or are pregnant or new parents, both during the 3-year calculation period for the self-employed income support scheme and also during the pandemic. Of course, we all know that Pregnant Then Screwed, their case very much highlights the issues arising in relation to the 3-year calculation period, and we're all following that very eagerly awaiting the judgment on that. But what I wanted to focus on in particular was the impacts of being pregnant and being a new parent during the pandemic. And how this has compounded the impacts felt by those who are already excluded from the schemes. And also limited company directors who have been pregnant or are pregnant during the pandemic, and new parents. And that's actually a category that I myself fall into, having become a new mum only 4 months ago. But one thing that we're really keen to stress in amongst all of this is that all of these different issues and impacts felt by those falling into this category, this all points to the very precarious nature of being self-employed in the very first place, and the lack of rights for those who are in a period of maternity, parental or adoption leave. I just wanted to highlight this by giving a few examples, particularly in relation to being self-employed and pregnant and going through a maternity period during the pandemic. So first example, a barrister who earned over £50,000 left her without no support from the self-employment income support scheme. Her pregnancy went into the beginning of the pandemic, and obviously then she fell into her maternity period after that, and was left with no income, no work on the horizon, and obviously not having been supported already because she was excluded due to having earned over £50,000. Another similar case of a theatre worker who also earned over £50,000 and was excluded from the self-employment income support scheme. And she found herself in her maternity period during the pandemic. And in theatre, we all know that the theatre industry is one of those that has been amongst the worst hit. And she has absolutely no work on the horizon and faces so much uncertainty in her profession. Someone working in television whose work is very much dependent on international travel. She had made provisions to support herself during her maternity period, but was excluded from the self-employment income support scheme for being newly self-employed. And Consequently, she used all her savings that she had set aside for her maternity period to live off, because she had been excluded, and those have now been depleted. And she is currently pregnant. She works in an area of television where international travel is an integral part of that. And of course, she can't take on that work. But not being classed as extremely clinically vulnerable, she's in effect almost excluded again, and that has compounded the impacts of being left without support for being newly self-employed. Or a limited company director going through pregnancy from the start of the pandemic, also working in the creative industries with her business that was decimated as a result of the pandemic. She had no reserves to be able to pay herself maternity pay. And the only recourse that she had was minimal furlough. But she couldn't do this initially because she had to save her business. And taking minimal furlough would have meant abandoning her business. And therefore felt it necessary to keep in contact with clients, pitching for possible future work, trying to figure out how to diversify in the earlier stages of her pregnancy. And by the time her baby was born, she had taken a bounce back loan, but that had all been swallowed up by mounting debts. And now in a maternity period, she's unable to look for work, and similarly being in the creative industries, faces much uncertainty, no work on the horizon, and also not entitled even to statutory maternity pay. So being self-employed or a limited company director and being affected in this way means having to save up, make provisions for one's maternity leave and pay, and therefore we're already in a precarious situation. So the impacts of being excluded from the schemes and compounded by being pregnant, by being a new parent, means we face decimated businesses, depleted savings, not able to work obviously during a maternity period, for many working in very precarious industries, and those amongst the hardest hit facing no work on the horizon. And we do very much see this as discrimination. From the data that we've collected at Excluded UK, just on a broader point, we do see that anecdotally more women do appear to be affected by the exclusion from the scheme across the board. The proposal that we have put together with all of the people speaking today, we really do hope that this will be adopted by the Treasury, so that those who've been disadvantaged purely by being pregnant or being a new parent will finally be supported, and that this discrimination will be rectified. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonali, for setting that out so clearly. I've lost my sheet with the speakers on it. Got it back. Thank you very much. Our next speaker this morning is Ros Bragg, the Director of Maternity Action. And Maternity Action have been campaigning for a very long time on a range of different issues to do with pregnancy and maternity. But are speaking this morning to set out their asks of the government on this issue. And I'd like to introduce Ros Bragg. Ros.
Thanks very much, Alison. Thanks for the invitation to speak to you this morning. I last spoke to this group in August when you were looking at the experiences of pregnant women and new mothers. I'd like to say that the issues we raised at that time have been taken on by government, but that's sadly not the case. We have made some progress, but there are ongoing gaps in support and some new gaps which have emerged from the latest iteration of the support schemes. One positive change has been the release of occupational health guidance on pregnant women and the pandemic. This is helpful guidance, even if it came out in December, 9 months after it should have been released. It hasn't been widely promoted, so it is unfortunately likely to remain largely unknown by those who need it, but it does fill a gap in the resources provided by government. But now that we have this guidance, the big gap in occupational health protection for pregnant women is support for women who should be suspended on full pay. Health and safety law requires employers to suspend pregnant women on full pay when they cannot otherwise offer the woman a safe working environment. It's an entitlement which preceded the pandemic, but which is obviously of much greater importance in the pandemic as women face the risk of infection. There are consequently significantly more women who need to be placed on maternity suspension, and employers have to carry this cost. They can, of course, place a woman on furlough and top it up to 100%, but we know from our advice line that few employers do this. There is a significant financial barrier to women's safety at work when they're pregnant. And in practice, you have women who are resigning their jobs or taking unpaid leave in order to deal with unsafe working conditions. We're calling for the furlough scheme to protect pregnant women at work by enabling employers to recover 100% of maternity suspension for a woman who is 28 weeks pregnant or beyond, or who is pregnant and extremely clinically vulnerable and otherwise medically advised to shield. The reason why we've chosen 28 weeks is because the international evidence has consistently pointed to 28 weeks as the point at which pregnant women are at greater risk of severe illness. There's no change in the risk of catching the COVID. However, there's a significantly increased risk of severe illness when they catch it. Similarly, women with underlying health conditions are at greater risk prior to weeks 28 of their pregnancy. All of this is stated in the government guidance, which they released in December. Given the more transmissible variants of COVID which have emerged, we're arguing for a precautionary principle approach to pregnant women at work. We're arguing that maternity suspension on full pay should be the default position in the case of women who are over 28 weeks pregnant or who have underlying health conditions. For employers to suspend women for health and safety reasons, they must put the woman on full pay. For this reason, we're arguing for the CJRS payment to be set at 100% in order to remove the financial barriers to employers acting on this. As I said before, women are responding to poor practice by employers by commencing maternity leave early, leaving their jobs, taking unpaid leave. So there's quite significant impacts on women for employers' failure to take this move. This call for 100% cover for CJRS payments for maternity suspension is a call that we made jointly with the TUC, Royal College of Obs and Gynae and the Royal College of Midwives on 26th of October last year and again on the 12th of January. We haven't had a substantive response from Treasury ministers or officials as yet. On 4th of February, the Treasury Minister, Jessie Norman, responded to a question from Wira Hobhouse MP on this issue. He appeared to reject our proposal on the basis that it is not consistent with the furlough scheme objective to enable employers to keep people in employment. We just don't agree with this argument. On the contrary, we think that it reflects what Caroline Noakes, chair of the Women and Equalities Select Committee, described as the government's passive approach to gender equality. The effective exclusion of pregnant women from the furlough scheme since March 2020 has acted to drive women out of employment. It's fundamentally contributing to gender inequality. Our second call is for the self-employed income support scheme to discount a period of maternity or parental leave during the 3-year calculation period. Pregnant Then Screwed is running a judicial review on this, and it's clear that the Treasury is not planning to act before the outcome is known. It's an important issue, it's readily fixed, and we first raised it with Treasury ministers in April 2020, and it clearly remains a concern. Our third call is for the CJRS scheme guidance to be amended to remove the unfair treatment of women who received maternity allowance rather than statutory maternity pay while on maternity leave last year. Eligibility for a CJRS furlough scheme is limited to employers for whom the employer submitted a PAYE real-time information submission during the period 20 March to 30 October of last year. So women on statutory maternity pay in this period will be eligible for furlough because their employer pays it to them and consequently submits a real-time information or an RTI submission. Women receiving maternity allowance are not eligible as they receive their payments directly from the DWP rather than from their employer. There's no difference in the nature of the leave. The difference is purely in the way in which they receive their maternity pay, and it's deeply unfair that they're not eligible for furlough. We raised this with Treasury on 8th of January. While they haven't replied to us, the Treasury Minister wrote to Wira Hobhouse MP on 21 January saying that without the RTI, the real-time information submission, it would be difficult to verify claims without significant additional checks. We just don't agree with this position. We don't think the potential for fraud is significant, and quite low in fact, because employers will only have 1 or 2 employees in this category, and the government could readily require evidence of maternity allowance claims and receipts. It's a very simple matter to check. So those are our 3 key outstanding asks for Treasury. 100% CJRS payment to place women on maternity suspension from 28 weeks or with underlying health conditions, amending the self-employed income support scheme to adjust for periods of maternity or parental leave during the 3-year calculation period, and amending the furlough scheme to stop the exclusion of women on maternity allowance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ros. It's really good to have those very clear asks for the APPG to consider. Our next speaker is from Pregnant Then Screwed, Sarah Ronan, the head of operations. And Pregnant Then Screwed, as has been said, have taken the UK government to judicial review. And I'm sure there's things that can and can't be said while that process is ongoing. But I'm sure Sarah will be glad to update us with the asks of Pregnant Then Screwed for the group. Sarah.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to give evidence. Firstly, obviously, like everybody else, we recognise that the government support schemes have saved jobs and livelihoods and were drafted and pulled together very quickly, you know, and consequently there will be some gaps, but where our position is that not enough has been done to address those, and we're nearly a year into the pandemic. Certainly those schemes have not considered the gendered and disproportionate economic impact of the pandemic on pregnant women and working mothers. Firstly, in relation to the self-employment income support scheme and our judicial review, we are still waiting a judgment on that, but I'll briefly recap why we felt that was necessary to take that action. Certainly, for a charity of our size, it's not something we would have embarked on unless we had felt that we had exhausted all other avenues. We had written to the Treasury multiple times, and I know that several MPs that are part of this group have also raised it on our behalf in Parliament. So our issue primarily is with the calculation that's used in the scheme as opposed to the eligibility for the scheme. So the calculation, as you know, is based on average trading profits for the last 3 years, and where a woman has taken maternity leave during that time, that period is cast as income for the purposes of the ATP calculation, and therefore significantly reduces the amount that she's entitled to under that scheme. We believe that's indirect sex discrimination. We believe that it violates Article 14 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and it discriminates against women who have taken maternity leave by failing to treat their situation differently to people who have not. We also believe that it breaches Section 19 of the Equality Act as well. So as I mentioned, our argument is specifically around the calculation of that scheme as opposed to the eligibility criteria. Initially, it was calculated that 75,000 women were impacted by the scheme, and then the government amended the scheme slightly to account for women who had taken maternity leave in the most recent financial year of 2018 to 2019. So thereby creating a situation where it wasn't based on eligibility, and pregnant women could avail of, or women that had been pregnant or taken maternity leave could avail of the scheme. However, the eligibility criteria, the calculation method doesn't go far enough, and it's that our argument is specifically focused on. So that judicial review was heard on the 21st of January, and we're awaiting the judgment on that, which we hope will be soon. We know that the judge did mention and said a few times that she appreciated the urgency of this, so we hope we're not waiting too long. The other thing just to say about the self-employment support scheme and our legal action is that we believe that the Chancellor has not complied with the public sector equality duty around that, and that it doesn't give due regard to the calculation and the fairness of the calculation. And in fact, broadly speaking, we believe that the government has failed to consider the gendered economic impact of its various schemes, and that this points broadly to a neglect of the PSED, and that has led to gaps in support. That's why, along with Maternity Action, Fawcett, Amnesty and the TUC, we added our names to an open letter yesterday calling on the EHRC to investigate the failure of the government to consider the impact on gender equality of its various schemes and support schemes throughout the pandemic. So we've been calling, and we continue to call on the government to rectify that, but that's now that moment has passed, and we await judgment instead. With regards to the job retention scheme and pregnant workers, and to pick up on Roz's evidence as well regarding the use of the JRS to cover maternity suspensions. We, on the 16th of March, as you'll know, pregnant women were classed as clinically vulnerable to COVID-19. So no increased risk necessarily of catching COVID-19, but certainly a very high risk of becoming severely ill if they are infected with the virus. Immediately, our helplines were overwhelmed with calls from pregnant workers that were just scared, didn't know if they should go into work, but also calls from employers as well, who equally were confused about what to do. Should they have pregnant women at work? How do they justify them staying home? So there was a complete lack of guidance, and in that vacuum of guidance, many employers were deferring to the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, occupational health guidance, and we had made the argument several times to government that that guidance should be coming from the government. It shouldn't defer its obligations to the RCOG, who has, it isn't responsible for kind of, employment rights or anything. We wrote to Matt Hancock in April. It was a letter that was signed by several employment barristers and QCs asking for that guidance. That guidance finally came on the 23rd of December, 9 months afterwards. Quite ironically, we could have had a baby in the time that it took the government to produce any kind of guidance and offer any support to the thousands of scared and vulnerable pregnant workers in the country. What we were finding was that in the absence of any clear guidance, pregnant workers were forced into being suspended from work on incorrect terms. That usually came in the form of being forced to take SSP, or it was in the form of taking unpaid leave. And in several cases that we heard of pregnant workers simply just having to give up work because they were being either forced to come in and feel at risk of contracting the disease, and not given any opportunity to work from home. So one of the things that we kept hearing was that employers simply couldn't afford the cost of the suspension and of that maternity suspension, which incidentally, as we know, predates COVID. That is enshrined in the Management of Health and Safety Regulations since 1999. We took the unusual step of writing recently to the top 10 supermarkets in the country, asking for their position on pregnant workers' safety and whether they were in fact suspending workers, pregnant workers on that maternity suspension, what they were doing to cover it. Only one retailer responded to say that they were using the job retention scheme for that purpose. We know also from asking about the job retention scheme, use of the job retention scheme for the purposes of childcare, that retailers have been deterred from using the job retention scheme. I think mainly through optics. They feel that obviously they've profited during the pandemic. They don't want to be seen to be taking advantage of it. And also there is a fear of ending up on the list, the published list of employers that access the JRS. And so consequently, we feel that where the JRS should be expanded to cover the cost of maternity suspension, but it absolutely has to be mandatory. There can't be a choice for employers around this. And if the government is genuinely committed to protecting lives and livelihoods, expanding the JRS for the purposes of covering maternity suspension is an absolutely appropriate thing to do in order to achieve that aim. Where we would differ is that we believe that that should apply to all pregnant women, no matter their gestation, not just in the third trimester. Our reason for that is that we don't believe there is enough research yet into the consequences or the impact of COVID-19 on pregnant women, their unborn child. Recently, we've collected two case studies. One, in a very sad case, a woman whose placenta had been obliterated by COVID that she had had early on in her pregnancy. She then went on to deliver a stillborn child at 32 weeks. The cause of death on that child's death certificate was related to obliterated placenta due to COVID-19. So we think that it is still too early. There isn't enough research yet, and we would like to see the JRS expanded to cover pregnant women of all gestations. Also on that point as well, I think it's important to recognise that during this wave, there is a significantly higher proportion of pregnant women in hospital with COVID-19 than there was in the first wave. We don't yet know the reasons for that, but currently 1 in 9 women under the age of 50 being treated in ICU for COVID-19 is either pregnant or has recently given birth. So the impact of COVID-19 on pregnant women at the moment is very grave. It is very serious. There can be absolutely no excuse whatsoever for not making this very minor tweak to the job retention scheme in order to protect these women. And actually, it's actually vital and critical that that occurs urgently. And I'm conscious of time, so just a couple of other points that I wanted to make around our asks. And one of those is also just to add our voice to the impact of so many women having to take unpaid leave on their eligibility for statutory maternity pay and statutory maternity allowance. That relates not just to pregnant workers who have had to take unpaid leave due to health and safety concerns, but also the thousands and thousands of women across the country that are bearing the brunt of homeschooling and childcare closures and who consequently have been forced into taking unpaid leave, and that then impacting their eligibility for SNP and SMA. So one of our asks is that we want to see their statutory maternity allowance and statutory maternity pay protected if they've been forced to take unpaid leave as a result of homeschooling. And the other thing that we wanted to certainly, kind of add to our asks and within the remit of this group is that we're hearing reports that gender pay gap reporting will be suspended again, apart from the fact that it's needed and we need to know what's really going on. I think it sends a really dangerous message about how this government is valuing women during the pandemic. Aside from gender pay gap reporting, we also want to see employers reporting disaggregated data around the sex of people that are being made redundant and those being placed on furlough. We need a lot more data to understand where, if people have fallen through the gaps in terms of support schemes and during the pandemic, we need a lot more data to ensure that going forward, that doesn't continue to happen and that we understand why that has happened and how we can better support those women going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was incredibly helpful, incredibly comprehensive, and it was good to see the kind of range of different issues that have yet to be addressed scandalously through this pandemic. And you're absolutely right to point out you could have had a baby in time that it's taken for some of this guidance to appear, which is completely inappropriate given the circumstances that we're in. We move now to maternity rights campaigner Bethany Power, who has had some presentations to the group before on the issues she's been working on. And Bethany has been was affected by the issues around pregnancy and maternity during the pandemic. Also put together the maternity petition, which was led to debates in Parliament as well. And Bethany, I'd like to hand over to you to present now, Bethany.
Thank you, Alison. So we've all joined together within this meeting and drawn up on a Treasury proposal that we would like the Treasury to avoid and address the issues relating to maternity, parental and adoption leave. Within those asks, there's 10 proposals that we would like the Treasury to look upon and take action to amend the issues relating. But I'm going to speak about the people who were affected on maternity leave when the COVID-19 pandemic happened. Sarah did touch upon that many mothers were forced within the unpaid period of their leave. So within maternity, an employer is meant to understand that a mother has needed to take a full year of maternity leave. But if a mother wanted to return earlier, they needed to give 8 weeks notice to end their maternity leave earlier. This made it awfully difficult for mothers to return when they could only financially afford. So many mothers could only afford the 9 months or less of their maternity leave. So this was pre-planned before COVID in affordability status of their own living. Many mothers were forced into the unpaid period of their leave, taking the full year of their maternity leave. They were denied furlough due to the lack of guidance supported by the government or what job sector that they're in or being self-employed. But more women were most affected by the end of the year, where if they did take unpaid maternity leave and then they were then with the furlough extended to April, so it was from October to April extension, they were in a position where they will now be eligible to be furloughed, but then lost their accrued annual leave. So for many mothers, they lost their statutory annual leave of 28 days, or for many, a lot more in terms of their employment status of length of service, etc., etc. But they also lost their kickstart days of when they planned to have. So what we're asking for the government to address is to support these women that were forced into the unpaid period of leave by backdating the payments for when they stated to their employer that they wanted to come back, but couldn't due to COVID-19. Therefore, if the employer had better awareness of the furlough extension, perhaps they would have been in a position where they would have been furloughed and treated like any other employee, whereas they couldn't at the time give the 8 weeks notice to end their maternity leave, to then be in a position where there was a lack of access to childcare and other means of postpartum care. But if they could, backdate with the furlough, this would then address the financial loss within their accrued annual leave that they couldn't apply. I know the government did guide that annual leave should be moved over across 2 years, but due to employers, this is down to discretion on the business, so not every employee is doing this, but this would support this matter. Along with the Treasury proposals, we are asking for the NHS exemption certificate to be extended by another 12 months. It states that although the government say that the dental is being sorry. Although the dental has been, the government has stated that dental care has been offered since June 2020, this isn't the case, and many mothers have fallen with not getting the dental care that they needed within that time. So just offering that extension, NHS extension for mothers that are needing dental treatment would also be helpful to amend the lack of postpartum care. But that is everything that I believe we have included as one party in this meeting. But I would like the Treasury to really read this proposal going by the meeting that we had in the beginning of December to address these issues on the maternity and parental and adoption rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bethany. And I think those are really important points there as well, that it's not just the sort of really obvious ways that women have lost out as a result of the coronavirus, but it has an impact on annual leave, it has an impact on the NHS exemption certificate, because if you need dental care just now, it's pretty difficult to get. We've been joined on the call this morning by a huge number of members of Parliament now. So we have Belder Biro-Adi, Caroline Lucas, Jamie Stone, Margaret Ferrier, Rupa Huck, Stephen Metcalfe, Tracy Babin and Vera Hobhouse. We've also had Peter Grant, who popped in as well, and we have a number of offices from MPs' offices as well, Lisa Cameron, Christian Wakeford, Esther McVeigh, Gerald Jones, Sharon Hodgson, and Vera's staff as well. So we can open up now to questions from MPs, and I'm just looking at the chat box to see, Caroline Lucas as well within the call here as well. I'm doing this on an iPad, so it's kind of tricky to see who's where within the screen that I'm looking at. So we can move now to questions from MPs and from others in the meeting. And Tracy Braben, I can see you've got your hand up.
Thank you, and thank you for everybody that's come on this call. Certainly, we know that women are. We know in our DNA that women have been unfairly impacted, not just by the response from government, but by COVID itself. It's cruelly exposed those pressures on women. My question is to Sarah Ronan. I know that Pregnant Then Screwed, an amazing campaign group, and a group that certainly the Gaps in Support have been reaching out to get an overview of what their expectations are of the judicial review. So I just wonder, Sarah, what would be your perfect outcome, and how could we then support that outcome so that we are prepared if that decision comes quite rapidly?
With regards to the self-employment support scheme specifically, so the ideal outcome would be that periods of maternity leave from the ATP period are excluded, and that the payment is backdated to reimburse those 75,000, 69,000 now women that have felt the impact of it.
So with the, if I may, with the Chancellor giving his budget in March the 3rd, it might be worth Gaps in Support making that case that the money should be made available for that to happen potentially. I don't know if other colleagues agree that's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, you know, like if this group could, you know, add its weight to that and call for that as a recommendation, then we would love to see that. I'm sure we all have lots and lots of asks of this coming budget, but certainly we're making them with regards to childcare as well. So, but yeah, the timing of that and seeing that backdated to reimburse those affected women would be the ideal outcome.
Thank you, Sarah and Alison. Thanks.
Thank you. And certainly what we're going to do from this meeting is we've already been working in the background to draw together all the recommendations from the different people who presented today, and to put that into a document together that we can then present to the Treasury, as we have done with the other excluded groups. Because I think it's important that we get all these things down on paper, that we make sure that the Treasury can't ignore these very reasonable requests that are being made here. And I keep kind of having in the back of my head one of the very first times that there was a statement in the House of Commons on coronavirus and support schemes and things like that. And I'd asked, and among the things I'd asked the Chancellor, what about pregnant women and people on maternity leave? And you could just see the kind of the sort of tumbleweed across the Treasury front bench of people are pregnant, what? So it is with some frustration that you could have had sort of not just one, I suppose, but two babies technically in lockdown if you were pregnant at the start. And we're still missing so much in support. Vera Hobhouse, I think you have a question.
I don't have a question. I really want this group to very carefully look at what I've been campaigning for with Maternity Action. Some of it might sound a little bit technical, but it is very much worth looking at the proposals. Because it wouldn't actually cost the Treasury that much money. It is just about changing some processes that exclude women. And I cannot for the life of me understand why the Treasury didn't engage with that. Because it is clearly an inequalities issue. It isn't a massive ask on the budget. They just need to put their mind up to it. And therefore, please, the 3 action points, very important to include in the list of asks.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And we just need to make sure that those asks are clear and that they go to government as soon as we possibly can to give them. I mean, certainly they've had adequate time to consider these things, but to make sure that goes in before the budget. Have we any further questions? Oh, yeah, Caroline, thank you very much for your comment there. We'll definitely keep the pressure up on this. Absolutely no doubt of that whatsoever. Anybody else that's wanting to come in here?
I could make an observation, not an actual question, but I mean, at the beginning, was it not the case that even women had to give birth alone? I mean, they've been incredibly slow and shocking on all of these things. And as everyone said, women have been so disproportionately impacted. And I just think pregnant women is a category that hasn't occurred to them. There was the case also of the nurse who I think was being made to go to work on the front line and died of coronavirus. So, sorry, I haven't been totally following everything. If there is a question, I mean, is it the financial stuff they completely won't budge on? Because that, I mean, we've had small victories of things that cost nothing. And just let us know what it is we should be asking and fighting for, because we have a voice in this. But I mean, it's just appalling how they've treated women full stop, and pregnant women particularly. I think also with the vaccine, I'm not sure what the situation is with that. So yeah, just wanted more information of where we're up to. And I think you've been very clear in your demands, so we're happy to fight for those. But what other stuff should we be doing or saying?
Okay, who wants to come in on that? Ross and Sarah.
Thanks very much for that, Rupa. It's lovely to have that request for what more we can do for pregnant women. I have to say it's not a request we get from government. Quite the contrary. I think the very first government announcement on the lockdown identified pregnant women as a vulnerable group at significantly higher risk than the rest of the population. And since then, we have had to argue for every crumb, every single change to any law, any guidance, any practice to accommodate pregnant women. Certainly in our experience with employers, is most employers just treat pregnant women as though they are any other staff member, because there hasn't been anything until December which suggested any other action. And even then, I think that a lot of employers have just dismissed it. And with the furlough scheme, there are quite specific changes we need to see. As Wira said, most of them aren't actually very expensive. We're not talking about a lot of women, but they're critically important for women who are dealing with the stress of pregnancy in lockdown, but also the financial pressures that come from the UK's very, very low rates of maternity pay. So they've got the compounding of a massive drop in income when they move on to maternity pay, and the loss of the furlough payments in addition to that, because the result for many women is not working, not getting paid, unpaid leave, or leaving their jobs. So quite significant financial impact. So I think for recommendations that we made are absolutely key at the moment. I think the work that's being done with the health system to try and sort out having a partner or someone accompanying you to the birth and so on, I think that work's underway. And I think it's fair to say part of that was that they had to reorganise the rooms in which a lot of the care was provided to make sure they could address health and safety risks. So I do want to sort of say that it's not quite as simple a debate as it might have been presented. I think there's been a lot of work done to try and move that along. And I think resourcing maternity services is critical here, because if they don't have the resources, they can't do what's needed to ensure that women can bring their partners with them. And in terms of the vaccine, if I can just comment on that, the basic problem with the vaccine in pregnant women is that there was no testing done, no research done with pregnant women or breastfeeding mothers when the vaccines were being developed. So we're working with inadequate information. And I think there's been a lot of work done to try and start collecting that data now, but we're working with essentially no information on that. So it's very, very hard to give good guidance on that. In this information vacuum, it's a classic example of just ignoring pregnant women at a critically important time in the research phase.
Thanks very much, Ros. Sarah?
Thanks. I won't repeat what Ros has just said there, but I will say that, you know, we agree, and we've obviously campaigned hard around the issue of birthing restrictions and partners, and we've even collected data here in that pregnant women are giving birth wearing masks and all sorts of things. So the impact of the pandemic on pregnant women specifically, it extends far beyond the economic impact of it. You know, it's been a really scary, vulnerable time, as pregnancy is anyway, but particularly over the last year, you know. But there was just a broad point that I wanted to make around pregnant women and working mothers being essentially an afterthought throughout this pandemic. Even if we look at the furlough scheme and the right, or not the right, but the right to request furlough for the purposes of childcare reasons, that was an amendment to the JRS that wasn't initially included. So that came 3 to 4 weeks after the JRS was first implemented. And as a result of, you know, people saying that this isn't practical, I can't homeschool and work. So even that from the very outset, and as Ros said, it's fighting for every single crumb off the table all the way. And all the message that is being sent, and it's been loud and clear throughout, is that the moment that you have a child, you lose your societal and economic value in this country. And that is what we are seeing that loud and clear throughout this pandemic. We have seen it where, as I mentioned, it took 9 months to produce guidance around the safety of pregnant workers, even though they've been classed as clinically vulnerable. Also, to make the point, as Ros said earlier, that guidance isn't being widely publicised or disseminated. And the core guidance for employers around working safely through the pandemic that was released when we were first all told to go back to work in the summer, that's kind of like the Bible for employers, essentially, around working safely during COVID. There's not a single mention of pregnant women or pregnancy throughout that entire document. The word pregnant doesn't even appear in it. Not only does it not even appear in it, it doesn't even link to the guidance that came out in December. I mean, that in itself is such a small administrative tweak that could be made that would help really to raise the profile of the issue of health and safety of pregnant workers. Again, an afterthought. That's all that we're hearing all the time. With regard to the HSC, I know that over the weekend there were reports around how the HSC classifies COVID and the seriousness of it as a risk. A few months ago, we made a Freedom of Information request of the HSC to find out how many enforcement notices it had served or cases it had investigated with regards to the safety of pregnant workers. And we were told that they don't classify read-or data, so they don't classify reports according to pregnancy, although there is specific provision in the management of health and safety regulations to protect that group of workers and to protect pregnant women and new mums. So where you have a situation where you have an enforcement body that doesn't even collect data that is specific to a group of workers, where there is legislation that exists to protect that group of workers, it can hardly be any surprise that everything else that's filtered through in relation to pregnant workers is incomplete and not comprehensive enough either. So there are gaps throughout, and all of it really points back to the perception that we have of pregnant women and the value that we assign to pregnant women and new mums. And I think it's a serious misstep by this government to ignore this now, because I think that we are looking at a generational rollback in terms of maternal employment. But I think that people really will not forget how they've been treated during this pandemic. Women won't forget it. That's what we're hearing from our community. And something else I was going to say with regards to that, I can't remember, so I'll leave it there. I could go on and on about this. and obviously childcare as well is the major burning issue as well in relation to how women have experienced this, and the lack of provision and the potential closures of childcare providers, because when we get to the other side of this and it's time to go back to work, if that provision isn't there and it doesn't exist, who is going to pay the price for it? The same people that have been paying the price for school closures and homeschooling over the last year.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to finish on, Sarah, there, because it's, you know, from our own circumstances as well, things like after school, it's a pretty fragile thing, but it's absolutely essential. If people aren't sending their kids to after school, they can't afford to keep their staff on, and then the service disappears and nobody can get it. So I think there's lots to be talked about there from government in terms of both nursery and after school provision as we come out of this crisis. Has anybody else got any points that they want to raise? Okay. And just ask our panelists, is there anything else that has occurred to you that you want to kind of chuck in just now before we close? Okay, so for the MPs on the call just now, there will be something circulated by the APPG Gaps and Support Secretariat following this meeting with the range of asks, so that we can get a document together and put that to Treasury as soon as possible, because we can't. I don't want to wait any longer, certainly, to get that out. So something will be coming through to your inboxes. Please look out for that and approve that as soon as you possibly can, so that we can get further action on this. I want to thank our four speakers, Sarah Ronan, Ros Bragg, Bethany Power and Sanala Joshi, for not just for their coming today and giving their presentations this morning, but for all the work that they've been doing throughout this pandemic. To highlight the very serious issues facing pregnant women and women in maternity leave, because those voices, unfortunately, we cannot rely on government to have those voices put forward, and it's the work of brilliant activists like the four of you and the organisations you represent to do that. And thank you so much for that on behalf of all the pregnant women and those in maternity leave right across these islands, because that work is absolutely vital. It's not work that should have to be done, I suppose, but it's work that needs to be done. You know, in a perfect world, none of these things would be required. But I'm so glad that you've been working on this and campaigning on this so stridently through the lockdown. And please know that the APPG Gaps and Support absolutely stands with you on that front, and we will do all that we can to make sure that that is heard by government and that these injustices are put right as soon as possible. And just something else popped in the chat. Yes, and thanks from Margaret, Vivian, from all of us in the group here this morning for your presentations. And please keep in touch, and we will do everything that we can do to move this agenda forward. Thank you so much. Have a good day.